Hello, I'm Victoria Rodriguez Roldan, and a big part of what I am trying to work on here today is the whole idea of how do we work on legislation? How do we read it? How do we go through it? So, like we were discussing in the documents in the written medium, you can go over and you go into the legislative website, and the federal level it's congress.gov, and there you can search for your bill text. Once you get to the bill text, what are you going to find there? Well, there's certain elements of a bill that are pretty much universal depending on the bill. There's usually a title, for example, the Equality Act, which I've used already as an example. Uh, it's named so. Usually, members of Congress will give it a pretty name for whatever they want to do. Sometimes the name is prettier than what the bill actually does, so don't be fooled. And also, one of the things it will do is have a bill number. For example, in the Equality Act, it's HR 5. That bill number is successive within that legislative session. So in the case of the Equality Act, it's HR 5, House Resolution number 5, which makes it the fifth bill introduced in 2019, in the 2019-2020 session. Um, and after the end of the Congress, those bills have to be reintroduced if they haven't been passed. Everything ends, and you start anew. Um, Another aspect, usually you might find an introduction to the bill. It will talk a lot about why are we doing this. In the case of the Equality Act, it might talk about, oh, look at all the discrimination LGBTQ people are facing. In an institutionalization bill, it might talk about the evils of institutionalizing people with disabilities or other issues that are happening, and why are we addressing this. This part usually doesn't go into the law. It's useful because it tells you what the lawmaker drafting it has in his mind, but it's not the core text that we're looking for. Another interesting part that comes out is the definition section. Basically, it usually defines the various major terms. For example, in the Equality Act, since it's LGBT discrimination, it will talk about the definition of gender identity or of sexual orientation. In the Disability Integration Act, you see definitions such as around institutions, around mental illness in the case of mental health initiatives, and so on. So the reason this section is sometimes important is they make it so that when you are interpreting the law later, let's say we pass the bill, it's now law, yay, good for the bill. Uh, it now is it now might be in court in litigation trying to define what does this mean, or the agencies need to pass regulations about it. What do we mean by X thing? And hopefully it will be included in the definition section that tells us that, basically. So another aspect that's usually after that, you usually start getting into the actual meaty text. This is where it gets tricky. As I said, sometimes the bill text is very straightforward, saying we will amend this, basically. Other times, it is more difficult. We will write this, blah, blah, blah. From now on, it's illegal to do this, or from now on, we shall do this. But other times, it's more difficult because it's simply amending sections of existing law. We have the United States Code or the US Code, which is basically the codification of every single federal law in the country. It ranges from the colors of the American flag to interstate commerce to civil rights law and everything under the sun that the federal government has legislated through Congress, federal crimes, all that stuff. So, what that means is that when we go through that, we need to think about, for example, we go through that and the bill text is trying to amend it. So now section 18.5, etc., it shall read this, or we shall add this thing to that. The Equality Act text that I sent is an example. That's one of the reasons I chose it, because it goes into the existing Civil Rights Act that you have to then go and read, which already bans discrimination based on race, religion, sex, and so on, and then adds sexual orientation and gender identity to it, basically. So you get to look at the bill, decide, and look at the existing statute as to how those two will interact if the bill is passed. And that's what the bill actually intends to do, basically. So that is a bit of the bulk of what you're doing there. So you should always, whenever the bill starts talking of amending certain sections of the US Code, you should look at the US Code in the Cornell website that I included. It's often listed by title. Every part of the US Code has a title. For example, Title 18 is all the criminal code and so on. One question is, what do we do with state legislation? Indeed, most activists work with state legislation a lot of the time. The only reason I haven't really gone that deep into it is because we're talking about a national audience here. But if you're from a specific state, what I suggest is that you look if you're looking for state bills, legislation before the legislature, go to the state legislative website, just Google it, say New York legislature, and there will be somewhere in that website, or Maryland or DC. DC has a very good site. Um, we'll have a search engine system where you can search either by keywords, by legislation number, by introducing member of the legislature, so on, and you'll be able to see when are the hearings scheduled, what is happening. It's very tricky because each state is quirky in how it does it, but every state has a legislative tracking of its legislation in its website. And there will be also, when you Google, for example, in the case of the District of Columbia, you just Google DC Code in the DC Council website, and there will be the entire codification of the local laws of the District of Columbia. So you can look up the law that is being amended in the case. For example, when we did the DC conversion therapy ban for people with disabilities who are under guardianship, the law amended the already existing conversion therapy law. So it was a similar case of amending an existing law. So with that, I'm always open to questions of people reaching out. But with that, that is basically the gist of it. Ideally, everyone should be able to search and look up their legislation and read it. It's one of the things that impacts our lives the most. And every citizen, every American should get to see what their government is plotting to do about them to impact their lives. And more so those of us who advocate for people with disabilities. So with that, good luck, enjoy life. Check out the materials that are written down attached to this video. Thank you.